and welcome to Kids Story Time. Our story today is about Abraham and Lot. We probably know a lot about Abraham, and a lot of children know stories about Abraham. We're going to go through a few incidents that happened between Abraham and Lot between Genesis chapter 12 and chapter 19. And while this may not be a very exhaustive story of everything that's happened in between, it does cover some of the important events and circumstances that go on between Abraham and Lot. And those events are things that we can learn a lot of lessons from. And that's the primary objective of having these stories, so that we can try to learn lessons for our lives today from these biblical stories. So as usual, we'll be listening to a video or watching a video where we'll see what goes on in part of the story, and then we'll come back to answer some of the questions and understand more about what those circumstances mean to us and what we can learn from them. So let's listen to the video and then come back and go to the questions.
In the land of Canaan, Abraham and his nephew Lot lived happy and prosperous lives. Both of them had a lot of animals, servants, and possessions. They had so many donkeys, sheep, goats, camels, and cows that they ran out of pasture. It came time for both Abraham and Lot to find a new home with bigger pasture for their herds. One day, Abraham and Lot decided to climb a high mountain that overlooked the entire valley. Abraham kindly said to his nephew, "If you go to the left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left." Lot looked around, and off in the distance, to the south, he saw the well-watered valley of Jordan. He also saw the city of Sodom, which at that time, he did not realize, was one of the most wicked cities in the world. But Lot didn't care. He wanted that beautiful land for himself. In the end, Lot chose the beautiful valley of Jordan and traveled away with his family, flocks, and herds. Abraham, on the other hand, went the opposite direction, each planning a new and prosperous life. When Lot and his family finally arrived in Sodom, it was much different than what they hoped for. It was an evil, sinful city with bad people. Lot and his family were the only people that served God. But they still decided to stay in that evil city. The city of Sodom was so sinful that God decided to judge it. He was going to destroy both Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though Lot was a righteous man, he had made a foolish decision by living in Sodom. It was time for him and his family to leave. God started his judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah by sending two powerful angels to help Lot and his family safely flee the city. Lot was afraid. He was hesitant to leave all his possessions, but the angels made it clear that everyone and everything in the city was going to be destroyed. As the angels were speaking with Lot, the evil people living in the city heard about it and came to Lot's house. They wanted to break down his door so they could harm them. They did not realize that these two men were angels from the Lord. Lot tried to argue with them, but the wicked men outside would not listen. At that moment, the angels sprung into action. They grabbed Lot, pulled him to safety, and faced the angry mob. Suddenly, all the wicked men were struck with blindness. They cried in terror, groping for the door and running around in a confused frenzy. "It's time to go," the angels demanded. "Grab your family and move out as fast as you can." Lot knew that they were right, even though he didn't want to go. "Don't stop. Go as fast as you can. Don't look back." Lot ran. His daughters ran. His wife ran. But then, in a moment of foolishness and longing, his wife looked back. Immediately, she was frozen into a pillar of salt. Lot was torn with sadness, but he kept running. Lot was still running by the time the sun came up. At the moment that the sun peeked over the horizon, the Lord rained down fire on the city, and in a blazing explosion of heat, smoke, and light, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Smoke billowed into the sky as the wicked cities burned to the ground, never to rise again.
All right. Our very first question is, where did God call Abraham to go? This probably wasn't included in the video that we just saw, but I'll still open up the question. Some of you children might know the answer to this. So if you do know, pause the video, go ahead and come up with the answer that you have. And if not, we'll jump back to the answer after the pause. So go ahead and think of what your answer would be to this. All right. So we read this in Genesis chapter 12. Abraham was living in the land of Ur with his family and his household and his dad and his entire clan. And God calls him, telling him to leave his household, leave his countrymen, leave the place he had grown up and he had called home. And God called him to go to a land that God was going to lead him to. Now, the important thing here is that God didn't tell Abraham exactly where he was supposed to go. He just tells Abraham, leave your country, leave your household, and go to the land that I am going to lead you to. And Abraham, he instantly obeys God. He believes in the Lord, and even though he doesn't know where he's supposed to go, he doesn't know what country he's going to go to or how it's going to be there, he believes that the Lord will do what is good for him and lead him to a place that is good for him. And he decides to obey God, leaving his countrymen, leaving his land, his place he had grown up, and he decides to follow the Lord, go wherever the Lord would lead him. So Abraham left his country, picked his wife and his, all the possessions he probably had, the servants, and along with Lot, he chooses to go ahead and travel to wherever the Lord wanted to lead him to. And this is something that we can remember, that when God calls us to do something, we can be like Abraham, to obey God in faith, even though we may not know what the outcome or where it's going to be or whatever is going to happen next. As long as we know that it is the Lord who is telling us to follow him, we can be like Abraham and follow him in faith and not having to, have anything visible to see and to understand in our mind. We can learn that, just like Abraham followed God by faith, we too can learn to walk with the Lord in faith. Our next question here is, how were Abraham and Lot related? Again, this wasn't in the video that we saw, but I think it's important to understand how these two men were related. So go ahead, pause the video, and if you do have an answer, think of it and come up with an answer, and then we'll come back to the answers after the pause. All right, so Abraham and Lot were actually related. They were relatives, they were not friends. They were relatives who were related to one another. And Lot was Abraham's nephew, or in other words, Abraham was Lot's uncle. And the way they were related was Abraham had a brother called Haran, and Haran's son was Lot. And if we read through the scriptures, I think it's in Genesis 13, we read that at some point Haran dies. And when Abraham is following the Lord's directions, eventually going into the land of Canaan, Abraham decides to take his nephew along. He decides to take Lot along with him. Instead of leaving him out, he wants to take Lot with him. And together they go and follow the directions of the Lord wherever the Lord is leading them. And here the Lord is leading them to Canaan. And that's how they end up traveling together. And that's how Abraham and Lot are related. They were family. They were related to one another, where Abraham was Lot's uncle. So if you can think about it, Abraham would have been much older than Lot. Lot was probably younger because he was, Abraham's nephew. All right, we'll go to the next question. So the third question is, why did Abraham and Lot decide to part ways? We probably would have seen it in the story today. At one point, something happens and Abraham and Lot decide to, go their own ways. So go ahead, pause the video and come up with the answers that you think, and once you're done, we can come back again. Right, so like we probably would have seen in the video, it got to a point where Abraham had a lot of goats and sheep and cattle, and he had a lot of servants to take care of them. And Lot had also got a lot of flock and sheep and goats and cattle, and he had his own, servants and herdsmen who would take care of the cattle. And as these men were traveling from place to place, in their pursuit to get to the land that the Lord was leading them, they would often have to go through, villages and towns and stay overnight and stay there for a moment. And every time they came to a village, there would always be a fight among the herdsmen of Abraham and the herdsmen of Lot, because they would always want to get water, get food, and get grass for the sheep and the flock. And it would always end up at a point where the herdsmen of Abraham and the herdsmen of Lot would always fight over the resources, whether it was water or food for the cattle. They would always end up fighting over these things. And that was when Abraham suggests to Lot, he says, Lot, it's not good that your men and my men are fighting this way. It doesn't look good in this land that we're staying. It's not a good testimony for us that our people should be fighting with one another in this heathen land. So he suggests that they should part ways. They should, split ways and go their own ways so that they don't become a burden to one another. And that is how Abraham and Lot decide to part ways. Right, our next question. This is a very interesting question and a very important question that we can definitely learn something from. Now, like we saw in one of our earlier questions, Abraham was a lot older than Lot. He was Lot's uncle, so pretty much the same age as Lot's dad. And when it came to decide how they wanted to part ways, we clearly heard from the story, and again read in scripture as well, that Abraham gives Lot the first preference. He says, Lot, let's part ways. If you decide to go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you decide to go to the left, I'll go right. Whatever you choose first, that's absolutely fine, and I'll go the other way. So my question is, why did Abraham give Lot the preference to choose first? So think about it and come up with the answers that you can think. And once you're done, you can come back into the video. Right. So like I mentioned, even though Abraham was older, he gave Lot the first preference. In a sense, like we learned in the very first question, Abraham, he left his country without having any kind of assurance in his flesh as to where he was going. He instinctively obeyed God. And it was the same thing that was going on in his mind here. He decided to himself, I'm going to let Lord choose and go wherever he wants to go first. And whatever is left, I'm going to go ahead with that because I know that the Lord will take care of me. He had a very firm belief that God was going to take care of him. No matter what Lot chose to do first, God was grateful and God was powerful enough to make sure that Abraham and all his needs were taken care of. So Abraham did not therefore exercise his right as the older person, saying, Lot, I'm the older person, let me choose first and then you can choose second. That's not what he did. He gave up his right. He gave up his privilege of being able to choose first, allowing Lot to go first, and then decides to go whatever, or decides to take the second option. And that's something that we can learn from. Instead of having to grab things for ourselves, we can learn to be like Abraham, and giving up our rights, giving up what is probably our right or eligibility. If we have faith in God that the Lord is going to be faithful to take care of whatever our need is, and I'm not going to be fighting with human beings, or I'm not going to fight with anyone over something that could be rightfully mine. So that's a very important thing that we learn from Abraham, who lived in the Old Covenant, who lived in the Old Testament times, that he was careful not to fight with Lot, and he gave Lot the first preference to choose as they decided to part ways. Our fifth question here is, as they decided to, separate and part ways, Lot looks into the valley and he chose to go to the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. So why did he choose the land of Sodom and Gomorrah? I think there was one line in the story that we saw that would answer that question. So if you remember that one line, pause the video, think about what the answer is, and think about why do you think Lot chose to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. And once you're done with the answers, you can come back into the video. Alright, so I think like we saw in the video earlier, Lot looked out into the wild and he looked into the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he saw how well watered that land was. He saw how fertile, how well that place was built, and he kind of instinctively knew that Sodom and Gomorrah was a luxurious place. Everybody had money, everybody had a lot of wealth, and life in Sodom and Gomorrah would be filled with luxuries, would be filled with pleasures. That's what he could see from afar. He saw how well the land was, how well it was watered, how well it was populated, and how many houses there were. Probably he saw a lot of big houses and he thought, that looks like a good place. I could go there, do some work, and buy a big house for myself and my family. So it was that external appearance, the wealth and the pleasures that he thought he could have in Sodom and Gomorrah that attracted him to it. Lot did not for a moment think, let me leave that for Abraham and let me go another way. Instead, he said, I'm going to grab what is best for me. I'm going to pick up my choice and do what's best for me. And that's what he does. He looks at Sodom and Gomorrah, and that land appeals to him very much. He's not very careful to think about how it would be for him and his family. He's just caught up with the fact that it looks good, it looks well nourished, and it looks so prosperous. And the riches of the land, they are what actually attract Lot to go there. That's what we understand from there. And another important thing here is Lot was not someone who waited or asked God for directions. He did not say, Lord, I don't know what to do here. Can you lead me? I want you to lead me. I don't know where to go. That was not Lot. Lot always went by what he saw was good to his eyes. And again, like we just discussed, the earthly riches and comfort of the land of Sodom, they were more important to him as opposed to the spiritual riches that probably he would be losing if he went to Sodom, as we get to know later on. So that's why he decides to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, our next question. Was God pleased when Abraham gave up his rights? Again, if you know about the story, you would easily come up with the answer. So go ahead, pause the video and think about what your answer would be. And then once you're done, you can come back and resume the video. Right. So, like you would have guessed, God was extremely pleased when Abraham gave up his rights as the older person, as the uncle, allowed Lot to choose first. And in fact, Abraham was the one who initially said, hey, let's not fight amongst each other. It's not a good testimony for us. And he gives up his privileges, gives up his right to choose. And all these things please God very much. The Lord is so delighted when Abraham does all of this. And as a result, God gives Abraham a wonderful promise. He tells Abraham to look all over the land, towards all the directions. And he tells Abraham, Abraham, as far as your eye can see, all of the land that you see, I'm going to give it to you. Lot may have chosen, something that looked wonderful and great. But God was now promising Abraham, because of his faithfulness, because of his trust in God, he was now promising Abraham that the whole land he was seeing with his eyes, that was going to be his own land. And that's something wonderful that we can remember. When we give up something that is rightfully ours, when we give up, our stand because we don't want to fight with someone, or we want to get someone the first preference, or when we give up our preferences, even though they might appear as if it's an inconvenience to us, God is actually tremendously pleased when we do that. And that's something that we can learn. We might face a lot of these situations in our homes with our siblings, in our school with our friends. And we can remember, I want to learn. We can ask God and say, Lord, I want to learn to give up, my right. I want to learn to not fight with one another and be like Abraham, putting my trust in you all the time. And that's something that's going to please God very much. A couple of verses I wanted to add to that is one thing that we can again learn is in Ephesians 6:12, we read that God does not want us to fight with any human being. However, provocative it might be, the Lord never wants us to fight with any human being. And instead, he says, our fight must always be against the devil and his powers of darkness. And that's something we learn from Abraham here. He never wanted to pick a fight with his nephew Lot. He chooses to give up his preference, and he learns to, he pleases God with his faith. And this is something that we can remember and learn from. All right, our seventh question for today's story. Why did the Lord destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? And I think this was pretty evident from the video, but go ahead, pause, and come up with the answers that you have, and once you're done, you can resume the video. Right, like we probably know again from the story, we read, and again we saw in the video as well, that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were very, very wicked and evil people. And they had a lot of detestable evil practices. And while on the outside it looks like, these people were so wicked and so evil, and that they were so violent against one another, so ungodly and so detestable in their practices, we learned something very important in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 16, between verses 49 and 50, we read what their sins were. And if you read that verse, it begins with the point that their sins were arrogance, being gluttonous, not caring for the poor, and being proud. And on the surface of it, it doesn't look like very grievous sins, being arrogant and eating a lot of food and not caring for the poor people and being proud. It looks like not so terrible sins, but the thing is that these sins lead to a slippery slope. And like we know, Their problem was sexual immorality. They had a lot of wicked and evil practices. And all of these practices begin with arrogance, begin with not being careful in what we eat, eating a lot, overeating, and not being careful to care for the needs of others, being disregardful for others' needs, for the needs of the poor, and being proud about ourselves, being proud about what we're able to do, what we have, what we can do to others. These things were the slippery slopes that led to greater and greater sins. And eventually the people became so vile and so wicked towards one another. And like we saw in the story, they were so violent to one another. And that's why the Lord decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And like we probably learn from the stories again, if you read scripture, you will see that He gives them a lot of time. He waits and waits, but then the Lord, His long suffering runs out. Their wickedness is so much, and finally the Lord decides to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. This is the last question for our story today, and again, like we probably heard from the story, and like all of us know, before the Lord decides to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, He sends two angels, and these two angels warn Lot and his family, and they escape in time before the Lord destroys, the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. But as they were running, Lot's wife does something, and she turns into a pillar of salt. So the question is, what did she do, and why did she turn into a pillar of salt? It looks like an easy answer, but there's something, again, very important for us to learn from that. So go ahead, pause the video, come up with your answers, and come back again into the video. Alright, so like we know, as Lot and his family were fleeing Sodom, they're running away as fire is raining down from the heavens to burn up the place. Lot's wife looks back at the place she was leaving, and as soon as she does that, she becomes a pillar of salt. Now, on the face of it, it doesn't look like something terribly bad. She's running away from, a city that's being destroyed, and she probably looked back to, we could think she just looked back to see what was happening. But when the angels actually, warned Lot and his family to run away, they clearly told him and his family, do not look back. Whatever you do, run away from here. Don't look back. But despite that warning, Lot's wife decides to look back as she's fleeing, and she becomes a pillar of salt. And one of the things that I learned from Brother Zach is that it would have been possible that Lot's wife had, a wonderful house that she was, leaving behind in Sodom. She had a wonderful garden or a wonderful dwelling place. She had a lot of money or a lot of possessions. She had a lot of things that she was leaving behind, which was probably burdening her heart. And she maybe just turned back to see and to feel in her heart, oh, these are all the things I'm leaving behind. Oh, my house, my wonderful garden, my wealth, my dresses, and all those things that I had, all those luxuries and treasures I had to leave now. And the verse that we can remember there is Matthew 6:21. It's a very important verse that Jesus says. He says, wherever your treasure is, there is also your heart. So if your treasure is set on earthly things like houses and riches and money and land and cars and comfort and fame and honor, if your treasure is set on those things, that means your heart is also set on those things. And when your heart is set on earthly things, there's no room for God to dwell in that heart. It is impossible for God to dwell in that heart. And that's a warning for us. However much, we have to work hard for our school, our jobs, and things of this earth, we have to be careful and ask God for help that none of these things become our eternal treasure. We never want to get to a point where all that we do is so that we get more money, or we get more fame, or we get more honor. All these things will one day perish, and what will last for eternity is the life that we have lived for God. And that's something that we can learn. We can learn to live a life where our treasure is set on God and where our heart is set on God. I just want to close with the usual credits. All the images I've used in today's story were from freebibleimages.org. The video that we saw earlier was from Share Faith Kids. And a lot of what I've learned in this story and what I've understood from the story is from the commentary of Brother Zach in the Through the Bible book, which you can find on cfcindia.com. And you can go through the book, listen to the audio series or the video series, and you can understand how every book in the Bible has so much for us to learn from, has so much for us to understand and apply for in our day-to-day lives. Thank you, and God bless you.